It begins in a place where time stands still. A hollow, deep in the Appalachian Mountains where fog clings to the trees and silence settles heavier than rain. Roads wind into nothing, and cabins sit half buried in the earth, their windows dark, their chimneys long cold. This is a land where whispers move faster than truth, where every rumor feels like prophecy. Among those whispers, one story spread like wildfire. It spoke of a girl, barely 14, forced to call her father husband. In a community where isolation shaped survival, the claim was too disturbing to ignore. Neighbors swore they had seen her, bent over a washtub, her swollen ankles trembling beneath a faded dress, her gaze fixed firmly on the dirt. She did not speak. She did not smile. Her body, carrying the unmistakable weight of pregnancy, told a story she herself could not. At night, the silence of the hollow was broken by strange sounds. Arguments muffled through wooden walls, the heavy slam of a door, and, most chilling of all, the broken rhythm of prayers whispered into darkness. Some swore they heard the girl's cries strangled before they could rise. Others dismissed it as the wind, as coyotes, as anything but what their hearts feared was true. Yet unease clung to the valley like damp air. One farmer recalled passing the cabin late one evening. From the porch he caught a glimpse of her, barefoot, clutching the rail, her face pale as the moonlight. When he raised his hand to greet her, she turned away, retreating inside before he could speak. Like a ghost, he said years later. Only it was no ghost. It was flesh, blood, and sorrow. The people of this hollow were not strangers to hardship. Poverty, sickness, and tragedy had always haunted their lives. But this secret felt different, heavier, as if a storm had gathered not in the skies, but inside the very bones of the family at its center. And still, no one intervened. Fear, pride, and the unspoken law of family business stays within family walls, kept mouths closed and eyes averted. By the time investigators arrived, decades later, the cabin had already rotted into the soil. Its roof caved, its floorboards devoured by moss. What remained was not evidence but echoes. Too much had already been erased, documents missing, testimonies vague. Neighbors aged into forgetfulness or carried their truths to the grave. But one question lingered, gnawing at every story told, every rumor retold. How could such horror exist, hidden in plain sight, protected not by distance but by silence? And if this girl's story was true, what else remained buried in the valleys of America's forgotten past? They called him Sir in public. But in whispers, he was only ever called the man at the end of the road. His land stretched wide across the valley, acres of soil, barns filled with livestock, and a house perched alone at the end of a dirt path where dust hung in the air, long after a wagon passed. For most, he was both a pillar and a threat. Respectable, yes, but also untouchable. Men worked his fields. Women nodded politely when he passed. Nobody questioned him, not to his face. Neighbors described him as strict, a man of rules. His handshake was iron, his gaze unrelenting. Behind closed doors, however, his reputation was darker. He controlled his children the way he controlled his cattle. Firm boundaries, no disobedience. And when his wife, young, frail, and worn down by illness, died suddenly, something in the order of the household changed. At first it was subtle. Witnesses recall how his daughter, barely a girl then, began to sit in her mother's place at the dinner table. At church, where once his wife had joined him in prayer, the girl now sat quietly by his side. And then, in the most chilling detail, neighbors began to notice the daughter rarely left his sight at all. A former acquaintance remembered visiting the homestead. She carried herself different. Not like a child anymore, more like a wife who knew her duty. But her eyes, they told another story. Fear, exhaustion. She never spoke unless he told her to. Whispers spread. Some swore they heard crying at night, muffled behind the heavy wooden walls of that isolated home. Others claimed the girl's laughter. The natural laughter of a child was gone, replaced by silence. And silence was exactly what protected him. For years, that silence kept outsiders at bay. The town itself seemed unwilling to intervene. After all, this was his land, his family, his dominion. Who would dare accuse a man with such standing? And yet, details continued to seep out. Farmers spoke of how he never sought companionship after his wife's death. No courting, no remarriage, no trips into town for female company. Everything he needed, it seemed, was already within those walls. The most unsettling testimony came decades later, from a man who had once delivered supplies. He claimed that when he arrived unannounced one stormy evening, the daughter, now older, pale, thin, was the one who greeted him. She clutched her father's coat around her shoulders, as though it belonged to her. The look she gave me, he said, wasn't just sadness. It was resignation. Like she had already been claimed. By then, suspicions had grown too heavy to ignore. The community began to murmur that she had not simply replaced her mother's seat at the table. She had replaced her mother entirely. But here lies the haunting question. Was she a victim of circumstance, or was she forced into a role she could never escape? The dirt road to that house is long gone, swallowed by weeds and time. But the memory of his dominion lingers, wrapped in silence, demanding the same unanswered question: who protected him? While she was left with no one. In small towns like these, bloodlines run deep. And secrets run even deeper. The neighbors were not blind. They saw the girl's figure changing, her shoulders narrowing, her stomach swelling in ways that defied innocence. They noticed the way she walked slower, the way her body seemed heavier with each passing season. But no one reported it. No one dared. Why? The reasons were many, and they were terrifying. Some feared the man's wrath. He was not just another farmer. He was a landowner, a patriarch, a man whose word carried weight in the marketplace and in the church pews. Others feared something less tangible, something eternal. The belief that meddling in another man's household could invite God's judgment. To them, questioning what happened behind closed doors was to trespass against Scripture itself. And for many, the unspoken rule was carved as deep as the oak trees around their farms. Family business stays within family walls. The local church elders remembered him well. They described a man who carried his Bible everywhere, thumbing through pages until he found the verses that seemed to bend to his will. "Honor thy father," he would remind them. "Wives, submit yourselves," he would emphasize. Those who heard him preach in men's gatherings recalled how Scripture became less about faith and more about control. But outside the sanctuary, whispers told another story. One woman, decades later, admitted that she and her husband considered stepping in. "We knew something wasn't right. She was too young, too frail, and she wasn't hiding the signs. But proof? We had none. And courage? We had even less. The fear was not unfounded." A farmhand once spread rumors about the man's temper, how a single word against him could cost you work, your reputation, or worse. In a town where survival hinged on community ties, crossing him was unthinkable, and so the silence thickened. The girl's condition advanced in plain sight, yet the community's eyes looked away. Rural America has always thrived on isolation, but in this isolation, danger is not just hidden, it is protected. The tragedy was not only the father's dominion, but the collective decision of an entire town to let it stand unchallenged. They buried their suspicions under hymns sung on Sunday mornings, under nods exchanged in the market, under the shared conviction that it was not their place to intervene. Years later, when confronted by outsiders, many admitted to guilt. They had seen. They had known. But they had done nothing. One old neighbor confessed on his deathbed. Her eyes pleaded every time she passed. "But when I thought of stepping forward, I thought of my children. What if he came for them? Better one family suffer," I told myself, than the whole town. The silence of the community became the girl's second prison, just as binding, just as suffocating as her father's grasp. And it leaves us with a haunting question. Was it the father's sin alone, or the town's complicity that sealed her fate? Her voice is missing. Not muted, not forgotten. Missing. No court record, no church ledger, no school enrollment ever carried her name in the way other children's did. It was as if she had been erased before she was even allowed to speak. What remains of her are fragments. A diary page written in a trembling hand, a half-remembered story from a neighbor, a blurred image of her pale face glimpsed through a lace curtain. She was a child thrust into a role she never chose. Some accounts suggest that as she grew, she stopped speaking in public entirely. When townsfolk passed her on the road, they recalled her eyes fixed firmly on the dirt, her lips sealed shut as if language itself was forbidden. Others said she wandered the woods alone, clutching a ragged child's toy long after her own children clung to her skirts. Silence was not a preference, it was survival. The father ensured her invisibility. She was barred from school after her mother's death. forbidden from gatherings, hidden from church revivals and community events. At the market, when necessities demanded her presence, he stood close enough to remind her. One wrong word, one wrong glance, and the punishment would be swift. Neighbors noticed her shrinking form, the way she seemed to fold into herself like a shadow. Present but untouchable, her silence was so complete that even decades later, investigators struggled to separate fact from folklore. Was she truly mute in public, or did the community simply refuse to hear her? A former midwife recalled a chilling detail. She never cried out in labor, not once, just bit her lip until it bled. What emerges is a portrait not of passivity, but of endurance. Her silence was armor. Words could betray her, could spark wrath, could cost her the fragile grip she had on survival. By becoming a ghost in her own home, she learned to move unseen, unheard, waiting, perhaps, for a chance that never came. One investigator, reviewing the scraps of testimony decades later, posed a disturbing theory. Did she erase herself to survive, or was she erased by design? Was silence her only weapon, or the final chain he placed around her? The truth may never be known, but her absence speaks louder than any record. In the hollow where she lived, the echoes of her silence still linger, an unanswered question carved into the woods, the walls, and the memories of those who dare to remember. And it forces us to confront a haunting possibility. Was her silence her choice, or the only voice he ever allowed her? The most haunting evidence of this union lies not in rumor of whispers, but in the fragile lives it created. Children, born from silence, born from secrecy, born from shadows. Old midwives long since buried themselves, once whispered of candlelit rooms where births took place in secret. The smell of wax mixed with iron, the sound of muffled screams pressed into pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear. One woman, her memory recorded in a late interview, recalled, "I was called once years ago. He stood by the door with a shotgun. I delivered a child, but I never saw it again." The fate of those children became the darkest part of the tale. Some claim to have seen shallow graves dug at the edge of the property, earth disturbed in rows too small for markers. Others remembered bundles carried under cloth at night, carried toward the woods and never brought back. Rumors spread of deformities, tiny bodies with twisted limbs, faces kept hidden beneath blankets, babies who lived only hours before being carried away. The isolation of the land made it easy for such stories to grow. But what unsettled investigators decades later was how consistent the testimonies were. Different voices, different years, the same haunting details. One child, however, is said to have survived. Raised as a niece, she was kept close but never claimed as a daughter. The deception fooled few. Neighbors spoke of her dark eyes, her uncanny resemblance to both father and mother. Yet she lived, growing into adulthood under the shadow of a secret no one dared name aloud. Still, questions gnaw at the edges of the story. Were there more children who did not survive? Did the earth by the old oak truly conceal tiny bones? No birth certificates were ever issued, no death certificates filed. Officially, these children never existed, but silence does not erase weight. And locals say that even today, when the soil is turned on that land, it feels heavy, too heavy, as if carrying what history refuses to acknowledge. One investigator, standing near the rumored graves, put it plainly: the ground remembers. Even when people forget, the land holds what they tried to bury. The chilling question remains: how many children of this forbidden union still lie hidden beneath the soil, nameless and uncounted? History leaves traces: paper, signatures, census lines, baptismal entries. But in this story, the paper trail ends in silence. The family seems to dissolve between pages, swallowed by a darkness more deliberate than coincidence. Researchers who combed through county archives decades later found gaps impossible to ignore. Entire census years where their names should have been recorded were blank, as if the household itself had evaporated. A marriage certificate, never filed. Baptismal documents missing from parish books. The town's clerk from that era wrote diligently, line after line, yet whenever this family appeared, the pen seemed to falter. Some suspected clerical incompetence, but the omissions followed a pattern too precise to be chance. Every missing entry coincided with the years when the girl should have been most visible. Pregnant, birthing, raising children. Exactly the time when paper could have preserved what whispers alone could not. Folklore filled the void left by absence. Old men in town claimed bribes had been paid, a few coins slipped into the hands of weary clerks. Others believed the sheriff himself turned away, unwilling to shame a landowner whose power stretched beyond property lines. Still others whispered that the church was complicit, refusing to inscribe baptisms that would expose the forbidden truth written in a child's blood. A former courthouse employee, interviewed late in life, recalled a locked drawer where sensitive papers were kept, documents that never saw daylight again. When asked if they could have belonged to this family, the old man only muttered, "Some things weren't meant to be remembered. The erasure feels less like neglect, more like intention." As though someone somewhere wanted to carve her existence out of history entirely. In the silence of missing records, speculation thrives. Did she ever sign her name on a marriage line? Was a birth certificate ever inked before being burned in a stove? Investigators remain divided. Was this the clumsiness of rural record-keeping, or the meticulous work of a man determined to bury his crime under layers of paper that never existed? And the most chilling question, if history itself can be rewritten by omission, how many other stories like hers have already been erased, leaving only whispers in the dark? Time has a way of swallowing stories, but the earth remembers. Decades after the whispers had faded, a group of explorers ventured into the ruins of the family's old homestead. The cabin was long collapsed, its timbers rotted into the soil, yet beneath the moss and rusted nails lay a secret the land had refused to surrender. Amid the clutter of discarded farming tools and the gnawed remains of livestock, the explorers uncovered bones, fragile, pale, and disturbingly small. At first, some assumed they were animal remains, but a closer look suggested otherwise. The curvature of a rib, the fragile line of a jaw, these were not cattle or deer. They were something far more delicate, something unmistakably human. The discovery rattled the county. Forensic experts were called in, but time had stripped the bones of clear answers. No age could be confirmed, no names tied to the fragments. Yet the size spoke louder than science. These belonged to children. More haunting still was the shoe. Half buried in the soil, its leather cracked and weathered. It was no larger than the palm of a grown man's hand. A child's shoe forgotten and left to rot beneath the trees. Neighbors who once dismissed the old tales could no longer look away. The artifacts brought the past clawing back to life. One woman, now elderly, admitted that she remembered small graves on the property as a child, mounds of earth without markers, quickly overgrown by weeds. Another recalled his father warning him never to wander near that house, muttering that the land was hungry. Their silence, once unshakable, began to fracture under the weight of what the ground had revealed. Yet even with bones in hand, doubt persisted. Were these remains truly tied to the forbidden union, or the remnants of another forgotten tragedy? Skeptics argued coincidence, that homesteads often became burial sites for animals or even strangers. But deep down, the community knew better. The land itself seemed complicit, holding its secrets tight for decades before yielding just enough to reignite fear. The whispers returned louder this time, no longer easily ignored. And as investigators packed away the fragile bones, one question echoed louder than all others. How many more graves still lie hidden beneath the soil, waiting for the day the earth decides to speak again? They say time erases details, but in this valley time only sharpened the shadows. The story of the daughter did not vanish. It twisted. It stretched like a whisper passed from one frightened mouth to another, until no one could tell where truth ended and folklore began. Neighbors swore they saw her long after her burial, or what they assumed had been her burial. A pale figure, faceless, dressed in white, drifting across the barns at dusk. One farmer recalled leaving his livestock at night and hearing the sound of a child crying. Soft at first, then sharp, almost animalistic. When he searched, the barn was empty, save for a single strand of long black hair caught on the wooden doorframe. For children in nearby towns, her story became a warning. Parents spoke of her as a curse. If you keep secrets, if you break the bloodlines' rules, she will come for you. These weren't stories told for fun. They were told with trembling voices, as though repeating them gave her more power. But the folklore had anchors, traces of something disturbingly real. In the early 1970s, police reports from neighboring counties began noting unusual children, infants with distorted facial structures, teenagers with brittle bones and strangely pale eyes. None of these cases were linked officially, yet the descriptions seemed to echo the whispers of that family's past. Local doctors kept their distance. One retired physician, speaking decades later, admitted that families begged him to look the other way. When pressed, he refused to reveal names, but muttered one sentence that still unsettles. It was never just one family. Skeptics argue that isolation breeds exaggeration. That grief, secrecy, and rural superstition combined to create a myth. Yet those who lived closest, farmers, midwives, even a retired deputy, insist they saw enough to believe. "You don't forget what you see with your own eyes," one old man told investigators, his hands shaking. "That girl was no ghost. She was flesh, and she should never have been born." The landscape itself seemed to conspire with the myth. Thick fog rising from the river made barns look like specters. Winds carried cries that sounded human, though no one was there. Visitors described an oppressive weight in the air, a silence that pressed down until even the bravest felt the need to leave before nightfall. And still, stories multiplied. One tale claimed she wandered the fields, cradling an invisible infant. Another said she knocked on windows during storms, her face pressed against the glass, featureless and blurred. In some versions, she was not one figure but many. Generations of silenced children returning together. Between fact and fiction, the valley refused to give up its truth. Something had happened, something that families, doctors, and lawmen all chose not to confront. And in that silence, legend flourished. A ghost, a curse, or the echo of something buried too deep to ever stay hidden? The answer remains unspoken, but one question lingers, growing heavier with every telling. Was the daughter a warning from the past or the beginning of a cycle that never ended? Decades later, when the whispers refused to die, outsiders came searching for answers. Not police this time, but a different breed. Genealogists tracing family trees, journalists chasing headlines, and independent researchers hungry for truth. They arrived with notebooks, tape recorders, and cameras, determined to untangle the threads of myth and reality. Their first stop was always the townsfolk. Many were elderly by then, faces worn by years of silence. Some spoke freely, their words trembling as though releasing a burden long carried. Others shut their doors, pretending not to hear the knock, or muttered "leave it buried" before retreating inside. But a few stories aligned with chilling precision, the same descriptions of strange children, the same cries heard on moonless nights, the same sudden disappearances no one dared to explain. The investigators combed through forgotten places, dusty church basements where ledgers were stacked in moldy boxes, county archives with pages torn out, handwritten baptism records that ended abruptly, as if someone had deliberately stopped recording births. In one parish ledger, the name of a child appeared written faintly, only to be crossed out in red ink. No explanation was given. Walking the valley itself became part of the investigation. The land felt oppressive, heavy in ways difficult to measure. One journalist described it in his notes. "It's as if the soil itself resists you, whispering that you shouldn't be here." The silence isn't empty, it's watching. Even ruins held clues. Investigators traced crumbling foundations, charred wood beams from a barn that had mysteriously burned, and fragments of broken toys buried beneath the dirt. They photographed claw marks on doorframes, though no one could agree whether they belonged to animals or to something else. But the deeper they dug, the stronger the resistance became. Local families refused interviews, churches suddenly locked their records, and county officials claimed documents were missing or misfiled. One researcher recalled being followed by an unmarked truck for 3 nights in a row, its headlights glowing in the rearview mirror until she left town. And yet fragments still emerged. A retired nurse remembered being summoned to the valley for midnight births, children delivered in secrecy, never admitted to hospitals. A former deputy claimed he was ordered to look away when he discovered graves smaller than coffins should allow. When asked why he obeyed, he said only, "Some things aren't meant to be brought into daylight." Each piece of evidence contradicted or confirmed another. For every missing document, a whispered testimony surfaced. For every sealed archive, an elderly witness gave a description too vivid to ignore. The investigators began to suspect that multiple children had been born, more than one generation carrying the same hidden curse. But what happened to them? Were they buried, hidden, or still living under false names? No record offers a definitive answer. What the investigators did know was this: the closer they came to exposing the truth, the more the valley itself seemed to push them away, and one chilling thought remained unshaken. If the records are gone, and the graves unmarked, then perhaps the bloodline never ended at all. Her name never appeared in the census. No birth certificate, no marriage license, no obituary in the county paper. To the government, she never lived, and yet her absence speaks louder than any record could. Researchers who tried to trace her lineage often met only with dead ends. Lines in the genealogical chain that suddenly broke. Whole decades where a family name vanished, then resurfaced, altered, disguised, or rewritten. It was as though someone had taken scissors to history, cutting her out, but leaving behind faint shadows of where she once stood. Her grave, if it exists, remains unmarked. Some claim it lies in the back pasture of the homestead, beneath a collapsed fence post where wildflowers grow unnaturally thick. Others whisper of a shallow burial near the creek, where children once found bones mixed with stones after a flood. No headstone bears her name. No prayer was carved into wood for her memory. Silence became her monument, and yet she lingers in story, in fear, in folklore. Neighbors still lower their voices when recalling her, as if she might still be listening. To some, she became a cautionary tale whispered to children: "Don't wander too far into the valley, or the faceless bride will take you home." To others, she was a symbol of a curse that stained entire bloodlines, carried quietly through generations. Even police logs from nearby towns contain cryptic mentions: children with strikingly unusual features, cases dismissed as anomalies, but recorded all the same. For skeptics, her story is dismissed as nothing more than legend, a rural ghost tale stretched over decades of retelling. But for those who lived closest, who saw the family, who heard the cries at night, the truth is undeniable. They insist she was real, that she was hidden, that she bore children no one was ever meant to see. The silence around her is perhaps the most chilling part. Every unanswered question, every missing record, every locked archive points to a truth deliberately buried. Not by time, not by chance, but by design. Someone wanted her forgotten, and yet she refuses to disappear. She is both forgotten and unforgettable, the daughter turned wife, the faceless mother erased from history but etched into the land itself. The valley still feels heavy, oppressive, as though carrying her grief. The winds that sweep through its fields seem to whisper with her silence. Whether fact or folklore, her story forces us to confront the darkest truths of America's hidden past. How isolation can corrupt, how secrecy can shelter horror, how silence protects the guilty. And perhaps that is the final, unshakable revelation, that her silence did not end with her death. It lingers still in the earth, in the families who will not speak, in the bloodlines that carry shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to listen.